The October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a familiar blanket, and Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of Grafton House, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. She had accepted Mrs. Venetia Blackwood's invitation to the monthly literary society meeting with her usual quiet pleasure, though she suspected the evening would prove more illuminating for its human drama than its discussion of Mr. Dickens's latest work. Mrs. Blackwood, a handsome woman of 60 with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, moved about her drawing-room with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to entertaining. The room itself was a testament to generations of careful curation. Chippendale furniture gleaming with beeswax, Persian carpets worn soft by decades of footsteps, and oil paintings of stern ancestors gazing down from their gilded frames. But tonight, it was the candles that commanded attention. They were everywhere, dozens of them arranged with mathematical precision across every available surface. Tall beeswax tapers in silver candlesticks, squat pillar candles in crystal holders, delicate votives scattered like stars across the mahogany side tables. Their flames danced in the slight draught that perpetually haunted old houses, casting a warm, golden glow that transformed the stately room into something almost mystical. "My dear Mrs. Blackwood," said Dr. Geoffrey Haydock, settling his considerable bulk into a leather armchair, "surely you don't require quite so many candles. The electric lights serve perfectly well." Mrs. Blackwood turned from adjusting a particularly elaborate candelabra on the mantelpiece, her pale blue eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Nonsense, Geoffrey. There's something about candlelight that encourages honesty. Don't you think? Besides, tonight is rather special." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, a pale pink baby jacket for her great-niece's expected child, with the mild expression of someone following a conversation that was perhaps a touch beyond her understanding. But her keen blue eyes noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Blackwood's voice, the way her fingers lingered just a moment too long on the silver candlestick, as if drawing comfort from its solidity. The other members of the literary society had begun to arrive. There was Colonel Melchett, recently retired from his London banking position, who carried himself with military precision despite never having served in the forces. His wife, Dolly Melchett, fluttered beside him in a dress of unfortunate purple silk, her laugh a touch too bright for the intimate gathering. Following them came Mr. Raymond West, Miss Marple's own nephew, whose artistic temperament and radical political views provided endless entertainment for the village gossips. The final arrival was Mr. Neville Strange, a man in his 40s who had recently purchased the old dower house and set about restoring it to its former glory, as he told anyone within earshot. He was handsome in a rather theatrical way, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes that seemed to catalogue the value of everything they looked upon. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, accepting a glass of sherry from the silver tray offered by Gladys, the parlour-maid, "you've outdone yourself. The atmosphere is positively medieval." Mrs. Blackwood smiled, though Miss Marple noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "How kind of you to say so, Mr. Strange. I do believe proper atmosphere enhances any discussion." As the society members settled themselves around the room with their glasses of sherry and plates of delicate biscuits, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. To the casual observer, she appeared absorbed in her work, but in reality, she was cataloguing every gesture or every inflection, every meaningful glance that passed between the assembled group. She noticed, for instance, how Colonel Melchett's hand shook slightly as he reached for his glass, and how his wife's bright chatter seemed designed to fill any conversational gaps that might allow for uncomfortable silences. She observed Mr. Strange's habit of checking his pocket watch, a beautiful gold piece that caught the candlelight, and the way Mrs. Blackwood seemed to be waiting for something, her eyes occasionally drifting to the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. "Well then," Mrs. Blackwood said finally, setting down her sherry glass with a decisive click, Before we begin our discussion of great expectations, I'm afraid I have a rather delicate matter to address." The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fire and the gentle hiss of the candle flames. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. Mrs. Blackwood moved to the escritoire in the corner, retrieving a leather portfolio that she carried back to her chair. "I've discovered something rather disturbing about our society's treasury. It appears that a considerable sum, nearly £200, has gone missing from our account." The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Melchett's sherry glass rattled against his saucer as he set it down rather too quickly. His wife's face had gone pale beneath her rouge. Mr. Strange straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from mild attention to sharp interest. "Missing?" Dr. Haydock's voice was carefully controlled. "Are you quite certain, Venetia? Perhaps there's been some bookkeeping error." "I've checked the figures 3 times. Mrs. Blackwood interrupted gently but firmly. "The money was there last month when I balanced the books for our charity donations. Now it simply isn't." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the expression of someone who had perhaps missed something important. "Oh my," she said softly. "How very distressing for you, Mrs. Blackwood. Though I must say, it does remind me of something that happened in my nephew Raymond's parish, the church roof fund, you know, though that turned out to be a simple matter of the treasurer keeping 2 sets of books by mistake." Her gentle words seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, though Miss Marple herself noticed that Mr. Strange's jaw had tightened at the mention of bookkeeping errors, and that Gladys, who had been clearing away the tea things, had frozen in the doorway. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation," Dolly Melchett said, her voice higher than usual. "We're all friends here, after all." But even as she spoke, glances were being exchanged around the room, quick, assessing looks that spoke of suspicions forming and alliances being reconsidered. It was then that Mr. Strange, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly lurched forward in his chair. His face had gone a peculiar grey color, and his breathing had become labored. "I say," he gasped, his hand clutching at his chest, "I don't feel quite—" The sentence was never finished. Mr. Strange's eyes rolled back, and he slumped sideways in the leather chair, his sherry glass falling from nerveless fingers to shatter on the Persian carpet. Dr. Haydock was beside him in an instant, his medical training overriding social niceties. But after a few moments of checking pulse and breathing, he looked up with a grave expression. "I'm afraid he's gone," he said quietly. In the stunned silence that followed, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Despite the draught that stirred the curtains and the commotion that had disturbed the air, every single candle in the room continued to burn with steady, unwavering flames. Not one had flickered out, not even those closest to where Mr. Strange had collapsed. It was, she thought as she carefully folded her knitting, rather remarkable. In her experience, candles were delicate things, easily extinguished by the slightest disturbance. Yet here they burned on, as if nothing at all had happened, as if they had been designed not to go out. Mrs. Blackwood stood frozen by the mantelpiece, her face pale in the candlelight. Should we call someone?" "The police, certainly," Dr. Haydock said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Though I suppose it could have been his heart. These things do happen suddenly." Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes took in every detail, the way the sherry had spilled in a perfect arc across the carpet, the peculiar sweet smell that seemed to linger in the air despite the open windows, and most curious of all, the fact that Mr. Strange's own candle, a tall beeswax taper in a silver holder on the table beside his chair, burned with the same steady flame as all the others, as if someone had taken great care to ensure that nothing would extinguish the light. The game, Miss Marple reflected as she tucked her knitting into her bag, had most certainly begun. By the time Police Constable Mellish arrived at Grafton House, his bicycle bell announcing his approach through the October evening, The drawing-room had settled into an uneasy quiet. Dr. Haydock had drawn a tartan rug over Mr. Strange with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to death's sudden visits, while the candles continued their unwavering vigil, casting steady shadows that seemed to mock the disruption below. Constable Mellish, a solid man who had spent 15 years managing St. Mary Mead's modest criminal enterprises of poached rabbits and boundary disputes, found himself decidedly out of his depth. He conducted his examination with methodical thoroughness, though Miss Marple noticed he paid no particular attention to the candles that had so captured her interest, nor to the peculiar sweet scent that seemed to linger despite the opened windows. Colonel Melchett had appointed himself unofficial spokesman, his banking background lending authority to his pronouncements. Heart attack, undoubtedly, Constable. Poor fellow looked rather peaked now that I think of it. All this business about missing funds, quite a shock to the system. His voice carried the conviction of a man accustomed to having his opinions accepted without question. Dolly Melchett, however, embraced the drama with barely concealed relish. Such a dreadful thing, though one did hear whispers about his business dealings. Rather ruthless in his acquisitions, some said. Perhaps someone bore a grudge. She wrung her hands, her purple silk rustling with nervous energy, though Miss Marple observed that her distress seemed more theatrical than genuine. Dr. Haydock maintained professional caution. While cardiac events do occur suddenly, Constable, there was something about the collapse, the peculiar odor I noticed, that gives me pause. A proper post-mortem will be essential. Miss Marple's nephew Raymond, leaning against the mantelpiece with artistic gravity, offered his own theory. One must consider the timing, surely. The announcement of missing funds followed immediately by Mr. Strange's collapse. Either remarkable coincidence or deliberate design. Human nature rarely favors such neat explanations. Mrs. Blackwood remained pale and composed, though her hands trembled slightly as she straightened an already perfect antimacassar. To think this should happen during our literary society meeting. And the money. To imagine someone among us. Her voice trailed off, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something beyond distress in her eyes. Perhaps fear, perhaps calculation. Gladys, the parlor maid, hovered in the doorway with her tray of broken glass, her face white as her starched apron. When the constable questioned her, she could only stammer that Mr. Strange had seemed quite normal, though she had noticed him checking his pocket watch rather frequently. Miss Marple filed this observation away with her growing collection of curious details. As the official procedures concluded and the society members began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Blackwood with the aftermath. It was then that Gladys approached her, pressing something small into her hand with whispered gratitude, as if ridding herself of a burden too heavy to bear alone. Later, examining the object in the privacy of her cottage, Miss Marple found it to be a stub of beeswax candle, still faintly warm and carrying that same sweet scent she had noticed in the drawing-room. It reminded her of something, a church fete years ago where damp fireworks had required a special powder to ignite properly. The smell then had been sweet too, like flowers kept too long in water. By morning, St. Mary Mead had arranged the facts to its satisfaction. At the baker's, Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had always mistrusted men who restored old houses. They restored their reputations simultaneously. Miss Hartnell suggested that modern literature encouraged dishonesty, making the literary society complicit by association. The butcher blamed October shellfish, while his wife retorted that her husband knew as much about seasons as he did about sonnets. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement spoke with characteristic directness. Poor Venetia is being blamed already, though for what I cannot fathom. Those candles were rather theatrical, I'll grant you, but beautiful in their way. Beauty often occurs when people feel the need for protection, Miss Marple observed mildly, remembering Mrs. Blackwood's trembling hands and the way she had avoided extinguishing the candle beside Mr. Strange's chair. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm while her mind arranged and rearranged the evening's events. The missing money, the steadfast candles, the sweet-scented stub now wrapped carefully in tissue paper, three puzzles that she suspected formed parts of a single, more complex design. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she reflected, truth perched like a cautious bird, requiring patience and stillness to approach. Miss Marple, ever obliging, settled herself to wait and watch, knowing that in time all secrets revealed themselves to those who understood the art of listening without appearing to hear. Morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the peculiar intensity that follows dramatic events, when ordinary routines carry the weight of extraordinary speculation. Miss Marple took her breakfast, while Florence, her devoted maid, provided a steady commentary on the village's collective state of mind. The postman had reported 3 fainting spells among the ladies he'd encountered, though Miss Marple suspected these were more theatrical than medical in nature. By 9:30, the baker's shop had become an unofficial tribunal where Mrs. Price Ridley held court with characteristic authority. "Mark my words," she declared to anyone within earshot. "Men like Mr. Strange don't simply drop dead from shock. Too much worldly ambition, that's what did for him. And this business of missing money, well, one wonders what other irregularities might come to light." Her pronouncements carried the weight of someone who considered herself an expert on moral failings. Miss Hartnell, never one to be outdone in matters of village drama, suggested divine intervention. "Perhaps it was a judgment," she intoned darkly. "All those candles burning like some pagan ritual, and then sudden death. There's a lesson in it somewhere." Her words sent delicious shivers through the assembled gossips, who found the combination of mystery and morality irresistible. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham shortly before 11, his motorcycle announcing his approach with aggressive efficiency. He possessed the unfortunate combination of ambition and impatience that Miss Marple had observed in men who believed solving cases quickly demonstrated superior intellect. His initial examination of the drawing-room was cursory, his questions perfunctory, and his conclusions premature. "Natural death, complicated by village hysteria," he announced to Dr. Haydock with the confidence of someone accustomed to being right. "These theatrical types often create drama where none exists. Heart attack, plain and simple." Dr. Haydock, however, proved less accommodating than Inspector Slack had anticipated. "I've seen enough cardiac events to recognize the signs," he replied firmly. Stranger's collapse displayed none of them. The pupils, the coloring, the rapidity of onset, all wrong for heart failure. "I'm requesting a post-mortem." Miss Marple encountered this exchange quite by accident while visiting the post office, though she had timed her errand with the precision of someone who understood that accidents often proved illuminating. She listened with the expression of someone following a conversation slightly beyond her comprehension, while noting how Inspector Slack's confidence faltered when the missing literary society funds were mentioned. Her afternoon visit to Grafton House, ostensibly to provide comfort with a jar of her special honey, proved more revealing than expected. Mrs. Blackwood received her with the resigned grace of someone accustomed to being the center of unwelcome attention, though Miss Marple noticed the drawing-room had been thoroughly aired and the candles removed, leaving only pale rings on the furniture like ghosts of the previous evening's drama. "So thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood said, though her smile remained fragile. "I confess I slept poorly. Every shadow seemed to hold menace." She gestured toward Mr. Strange's chair, now positioned at an awkward angle as if no one wished to return it to its proper place. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, her knitting emerging with practiced ease. "Houses do seem to remember dramatic events. That lovely scent from your candles, for instance, so distinctive. It reminded me of something, though I cannot quite place it." Mrs. Blackwood's fingers stilled on her teacup. "Scent? I hadn't noticed anything particular. Perhaps the beeswax. I do prefer it to paraffin." But Miss Marple had noticed the quick intake of breath, the way Mrs. Blackwood's eyes darted toward the escritoire. Through gentle conversation about candle-making traditions, she learned that the candles had been specially ordered from Temple & Brown, ecclesiastical supplies in Bristol, weather candles, designed not to smoke, drip, or extinguish in drafts. More intriguingly, Mrs. Blackwood revealed that Mr. Strange had been particularly interested in her candle collection during his previous visits. He admired the craftsmanship, she said carefully. Apparently, he had some knowledge of antique silver. Previous visits. Miss Marple filed this revelation alongside her growing collection of curious details. Mrs. Blackwood had introduced Mr. Strange as a recent acquaintance, yet their relationship clearly extended beyond casual literary society membership. When Gladys appeared with fresh tea, Miss Marple engaged her in the kind, comfortable conversation that encouraged confidences. The girl's distress was genuine, but so was her relief at having someone to talk to. Yes, Mrs. Blackwood had been all of a tremble since the previous evening. Yes, the police had asked about keys to the desk where the society's funds were kept. And yes, she still had the printed slip from the candle box, kept with the silver polish. Something about fortified wicks for sanctuary use. Miss Marple examined the slip with interest. Temple & Brown, ecclesiastical supplies, specialized in church furnishings designed to withstand the challenges of drafty medieval buildings. Fortified wicks, indeed, candles that would burn steadily regardless of atmospheric disturbances. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind arranging and rearranging the day's revelations. The missing money, the specially ordered candles, the sweet scent that reminded her of damp fireworks. Mrs. Blackwood's previous acquaintance with Mr. Strange, pieces of a puzzle that suggested careful planning rather than sudden opportunity. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she reflected, someone had taken considerable trouble to ensure that their candles would not go out, no matter what disturbances might occur in the drawing room. It was, she thought, a most interesting approach to the problem of providing reliable illumination for one's activities. Tomorrow would bring the post-mortem results, and with them, she suspected, the first real challenge to Inspector Slack's convenient conclusions. The post-mortem results arrived at Much Benham Police Station on Thursday morning like an unwelcome guest, disrupting Inspector Slack's comfortable theories with inconvenient facts. Dr. Pemberton, the county pathologist, had discovered traces of digitalis in Mr. Strange's system. Not the massive dose that would suggest suicide, but a carefully calculated amount, designed to cause cardiac arrest in a man of his age and constitution, the poison of choice for someone with medical knowledge, or at least access to it. Miss Marple learned of these findings through the village's remarkably efficient intelligence network, which operated with greater speed than any official communication system. Dr. Haydock, vindicated in his professional skepticism, could barely contain his satisfaction when he encountered her at the post office. "Digitalis," he murmured confidentially. "Extracted from foxglove, most likely. Readily available to anyone with a garden and a chemistry set." The revelation transformed St. Mary Mead's atmosphere from dramatic speculation to genuine unease. Murder in detective novels provided entertainment. Murder among one's literary society proved considerably less amusing. Inspector Slack, faced with conducting an actual murder investigation, began his inquiries with characteristic heavy-handedness, though Miss Marple observed his methods with the patient interest of someone watching a particularly clumsy performance. His interview with Mrs. Blackwood, conducted in her drawing room with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge, succeeded primarily in confirming his prejudices about hysterical women. Mrs. Blackwood maintained her composure admirably, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands when discussing the missing funds and the way she avoided looking directly at the chair where Mr. Strange had collapsed. More intriguing were the revelations about Mr. Strange himself. Through patient questioning of Miss Weatherby at the library, Miss Marple learned that their recent literary society member had been far from the casual newcomer he appeared. He had joined only 6 weeks previously, sponsored by Mrs. Blackwood, yet had borrowed extensively from the local history collection, paying particular attention to properties that had changed hands recently and the great houses with their former owners. Quite scholarly in his approach, Miss Weatherby confided, though I did wonder why a man interested in literature spent so much time with property records and genealogical charts. The afternoon brought Colonel Melchett to Miss Marple's cottage in a state of barely controlled agitation. His usual military bearing was compromised by nervous energy that manifested in rapid pacing and frequent consultation of his pocket watch. Over tea, he revealed that Mr. Strange had been making systematic inquiries about the literary society members' backgrounds, banking experience with Colonel Melchett, medical investments with Dr. Haydock, artistic patronage with Raymond West. "The thing is," Colonel Melchett confided, his cup rattling against its saucer, "Strange seemed to know altogether too much about our charitable activities. Knew exactly which organizations we supported, how much we donated, even the timing of our contributions. Said he was impressed by our community spirit, but it struck me as rather too well informed for casual interest." Most disturbing was Gladys's revelation, shared in whispered confidence when Miss Marple encountered her at the baker's. The parlor maid had noticed something curious about the sherry service that evening. Mr. Strange had initially accepted a glass from Dr. Haydock, then suddenly switched it for another from the tray, claiming his had a smudge. "Funny thing was," Gladys murmured, "I'd polished every glass myself that afternoon. There weren't no smudges." Miss Marple filed this information alongside her growing collection of curious details. A man who researched his victims systematically, who knew their financial arrangements intimately, who was careful about which glass he drank from, yet who had still died of digitalis poisoning. Either Mr. Strange had been outmaneuvered by someone even more methodical than himself, or his caution had been deliberately overcome by superior planning. The specially ordered candles took on new significance in this context. Someone had ensured the drawing room would remain steadily lit throughout the evening's events, preventing any convenient darkness that might obscure their activities. The sweet scent she had noticed, not from the candles themselves, but perhaps from something used to mask the bitter almond smell that sometimes accompanied certain preparations. As evening approached, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, reflecting on the pattern emerging from her inquiries. Mr. Strange had not been an innocent victim, but a systematic investigator, gathering information about the Literary Society's members and their financial arrangements. His death suggested he had discovered something worth killing for, or had threatened someone who preferred their secrets buried. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was congratulating themselves on eliminating a threat, confident that suspicion would fall on the obvious candidates while they remained safely hidden among the shocked community. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous secrets often lay disguised as the mundane, the overlooked, the utterly unremarkable. The game, she reflected, was becoming quite interesting indeed. Inspector Slack arrived at Grafton House on Friday morning with the methodical determination of a man convinced that murder investigations required nothing more than systematic questioning and obvious motives. He had identified 3 primary suspects and intended to pursue each with the relentless efficiency that had served him well in cases involving stolen chickens and boundary disputes. Mrs. Venetia Blackwood, as hostess and treasurer, topped his list, followed by Dr. Haydock with his medical knowledge, and young Gladys with her nervous disposition and household access. Mrs. Blackwood received him in the drawing-room with composed dignity, though Miss Marple, who happened to be passing the house at precisely the right moment, noticed through the window how her hands trembled slightly as she produced the Society's financial records. The missing £200 remained unexplained, a withdrawal slip bearing a signature that resembled Mrs. Blackwood's without quite convincing her of its authenticity. When pressed about her keys, she produced them from her reticule with careful precision, insisting they had never left her possession. "He was my guest, Inspector," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly, her eyes drifting to Mr. Strange's chair. "Whatever his intentions, he was still my guest." Dr. Haydock's interview proved less accommodating to Inspector Slack's theories. The physician's analysis of the digitalis poisoning was precise and troubling. The dose had been administered within an hour of death, requiring careful calculation and timing. "If one wished to poison at a social gathering," Dr. Haydock observed with professional detachment, "there are far subtler methods than contaminating a communal decanter. A sugared confection, perhaps, or something applied to an object the victim would handle." Miss Marple, who had developed a remarkable talent for appearing at doorsteps just as conversations became illuminating, encountered Gladys leaving the post office in a state of considerable distress. The parlour-maid's account of the evening remained consistent. Mr. Strange had indeed switched his sherry glass, claiming to see a smudge that she swore hadn't existed. More intriguingly, he had earlier inquired about the little blue bottle used for silver polishing, only to be sharply redirected by Mrs. Blackwood. The afternoon brought Miss Marple to the old dower house, ostensibly to offer condolences to Mr. Strange's newly arrived sister. Mrs. Penelope Strange, a fluttering woman with nervous hands, revealed that her brother had been obsessed with the house's history, convinced it held secrets worth uncovering. On the side table lay a botanical guide, open to a detailed illustration of foxglove varieties. In Mr. Strange's neat handwriting were annotations about digitalis extraction and a careful diagram of a particularly robust purple specimen. "He said the house held treasure," Mrs. Penelope whispered, "or perhaps a scandal that had been buried for years." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the patch of deep purple foxgloves growing wild in the neglected garden, the same variety described in the botanical guide. Mr. Strange hadn't been merely a property speculator. He had been conducting his own investigation, perhaps even engaging in blackmail based on his discoveries. Returning to her cottage via Grafton House, Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Blackwood's invitation for tea, with the gracious manner of someone who understood that timing was everything in both social calls and criminal investigations. The drawing-room had been meticulously cleaned, but Miss Marple's experienced eye caught details that others might miss. A shallow dish tucked behind the decanters, still faintly scummed with stale water, and a single pearl-headed pin glinting at the bottom. "Pins in water are so useful for arranging flowers," Miss Marple murmured conversationally. Gladys, entering with fresh tea, flushed at the observation. "Mrs. Blackwood does floating arrangements," she explained. "We had them the night before the meeting, little candles with pins to keep them positioned. But she told me to clear them away." Miss Marple's gentle exploration of the room revealed more telling details. A clearer patch on the mahogany near where Mr. Strange's glass had fallen, as if something sticky had been hastily wiped away, and along the baseboard by his chair, an almost invisible pale smear that might have been wax. Most tellingly, she discovered a second pearl-headed pin embedded in the skirting, evidence of the careful preparations that had preceded the fatal evening. Mrs. Blackwood's return with additional refreshments provided Miss Marple with the opportunity to observe her hostess more closely. The woman's composure was admirable, but her eyes held a wariness that suggested someone who had been living with considerable strain for some time. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind arranging the day's discoveries into a coherent pattern. Mr. Strange had been a systematic investigator, researching both properties and people with methodical thoroughness. His death had occurred in a room prepared with candles that wouldn't extinguish, among people who had been carefully studied and catalogued. The missing money might have been a convenient distraction, or perhaps the smaller part of a much larger scheme. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was sleeping peacefully, confident that suspicion would fall on the obvious candidates while they remained safely hidden among the shocked community. But Miss Marple had learned that the most elegant deceptions often relied on the mundane details that everyone else overlooked: pearl-headed pins, wax smears, and the careful positioning of light sources that would illuminate everything except the truth. The candles that wouldn't go out had been designed for a purpose far more sinister than mere ambience, and Miss Marple intended to discover exactly what that purpose had been. The weekend brought a subtle shift in St. Mary Mead's collective understanding of recent events, though few residents recognized the change for what it was. Miss Marple, however, possessed the particular gift of noticing when a village's carefully maintained equilibrium had been disturbed by more than simple tragedy. Her morning visit to Mr. Larcher's chemist shop, ostensibly to collect her monthly tonic, provided the first piece of a puzzle that was proving far more complex than Inspector Slack's methodical approach had anticipated. Mr. Larch, a precise man who had served the village's pharmaceutical needs for 3 decades, proved surprisingly forthcoming about recent transactions. Digitalis preparations, Miss Marple? Well, naturally, we stock them for Dr. Haydock's prescriptions. But I must say, there's been unusual interest in botanical extracts lately. Mrs. Blackwood collected quite a selection last week. Silver polish compounds, essence of benzoin for potpourri, and several cleaning preparations with rather distinctive scents. Miss Marple accepted this information with the mild interest of someone following a conversation slightly beyond her immediate concern, though her mental filing system carefully catalogued each detail. The sweet scent that had lingered in the drawing room despite opened windows was beginning to make sense. Not the candles themselves, but additives designed to mask other, less pleasant odors. Her afternoon encounter with Mrs. Penelope Strange, who had arrived to settle her brother's affairs, provided a revelation that transformed the entire investigation. Over tea in the Dower House's neglected morning room, the nervous woman revealed truths that painted her brother in an entirely different light. "I'm afraid Neville wasn't quite the successful businessman he appeared," Mrs. Penelope confided, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. "He was desperately in debt, Miss Marple. All those property investments he spoke of, pure fiction. He'd been reduced to what he called research for his writing, but I knew better. He was digging into people's private affairs, looking for anything that might prove profitable." This revelation recontextualized everything Miss Marple had observed about Mr. Strange's behavior. His systematic inquiries into the Literary Society members' backgrounds, his detailed knowledge of their charitable activities, his recent research into parish records, all took on a more sinister cast when viewed through the lens of desperation rather than casual interest. The vicar, when Miss Marple encountered him later that afternoon, confirmed her growing suspicions. Most peculiar questions Mr. Strange was asking, Mr. Clement admitted reluctantly. Baptismal records, marriage certificates, family histories going back 40 years. He seemed particularly interested in any irregularities. Children born under unusual circumstances, sudden changes in family fortunes, that sort of thing. The diocesan registrar found his manner rather unsettling. Miss Marple's visit to Colonel Melchett's home that evening, ostensibly to admire his prize roses, revealed yet another layer to the expanding conspiracy. The Colonel's defensive bluster about his financial management had intensified since Mr. Strange's death, and his wife's well-intentioned chatter provided inadvertent illumination. "Such a bother the almshouse fund has been," Dolly Melchett confided while her husband was fetching additional chairs. "All those old receipts and dear George trying to balance them with his London accounts." He was quite upset when Mr. Strange started asking about it specifically. Said the man had no business poking into private charitable arrangements. The Colonel's return interrupted this revelation, but Miss Marple had heard enough. The missing £200 from the Literary Society was apparently only one of several financial irregularities that Mr. Strange had uncovered in his desperate search for blackmail material. A man facing bankruptcy might well have seen the village's charitable activities as a source of potential income, particularly if those activities weren't being managed with complete transparency. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the day's discoveries while her knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. Mr. Strange hadn't been a casual newcomer to the literary society, but a systematic investigator, driven by financial desperation to exploit whatever secrets he could uncover. His death had occurred in a room where every detail had been carefully orchestrated. The positioning of furniture, the selection of refreshments, the placement of candles designed to burn steadily regardless of atmospheric disturbances. But the most intriguing aspect was the growing evidence that multiple villagers had reason to fear Mr. Strange's investigations. Mrs. Blackwood's missing funds, Colonel Melchett's almshouse irregularities, and potentially other secrets yet to be uncovered, all provided motives for murder. The question was no longer who had wanted Mr. Strange dead, but who had possessed both the knowledge and the nerve to orchestrate his elimination with such meticulous precision. The candles that wouldn't go out had been selected for a specific purpose, Miss Marple realized. Someone had wanted to ensure that every detail of that evening would be clearly visible, that no shadows would obscure their carefully planned performance. But in providing such steady illumination, they had also ensured that Miss Marple's keen eyes would miss nothing of their elaborate deception. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was congratulating themselves on eliminating a threat while successfully directing suspicion toward obvious targets. But Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous secrets often lay hidden in plain sight, disguised as the mundane details that everyone else overlooked. The game was becoming quite fascinating indeed, and she intended to see it played to its conclusion. The coroner's inquest concluded on Monday morning with the expected adjournment pending further police inquiries, a formality that pleased Inspector Slack because it conveyed official progress without committing him to premature conclusions. St. Mary Mead received the news with that mixture of relish and alarm which attends calamities occurring sufficiently close to provide entertainment while remaining safely distant from personal involvement. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a lesson about fashionable candles and foreign notions, while Miss Hartnell traced the matter to moral laxity encouraged by modern literature. Inspector Slack, fortified by the word digitalis and armed with a growing list of suspects compiled from village gossip, applied himself to his renewed investigation with the methodical determination of someone pruning a hedge, vigorously and with little tenderness for subtleties. Mrs. Blackwood's composed dignity he labeled suspicious artifice. Dr. Haydock's medical precision struck him as conveniently comprehensive, and young Gladys's persistent trembling appeared to be the surest sign of guilty knowledge. Miss Marple, who had observed many promising investigations ruined by such heavy-handed approaches, decided to take a morning constitutional past Grafton House, her basket of fresh scones providing the perfect excuse for a neighborly visit. The drawing-room presented a curious contrast to its dramatic state 3 evenings prior. The candlesticks gleamed with fresh polish, their sockets meticulously clean, and the brass snuffer showed remarkably little evidence of recent use for such an extensively illuminated evening. Gladys, grateful for any kindness during her ordeal of official questioning, confided that the little blue bottle of silver polish had mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared in the pantry. "I never touched it after cleaning day, Miss Marple, but someone certainly did. And those candle stubs. Mrs. Blackwood insisted they all be trimmed to exactly the same length before disposal, though I couldn't see the sense in it." The afternoon brought an urgent message from Mrs. Penelope Strange requesting Miss Marple's immediate assistance at the Dower House. The morning room presented the bleak disorder of a systematic search performed by someone who knew precisely what they sought. Drawers gaped at awkward angles, papers lay scattered across the carpet, and a single chair had been overturned with theatrical precision. Most tellingly, the grate contained pale, resinous ash that scented the air with the same sweet fragrance Miss Marple had noticed during the fatal evening. "They took his papers, all his careful lists and notes," Mrs. Penelope sobbed, wringing her hands in distress. "But I found this wedged behind the desk." She produced a slim notebook, its leather cover scorched as though someone had attempted to snatch it from flames. The pages revealed Mr. Strange's meticulous record-keeping. initials paired with figures in his precise handwriting. VB 200, GM 80, GH 40, and several others reduced to enigmatic letters and amounts. More intriguing was a page headed Arrangements with detailed notes about fortified wicks, benzoin for scent masking, and the underlined phrase, "No draft permissible." A tiny pearl-headed pin secured a scrap of paper bearing the ominous notation, "If subject resists prepared glass, employ alternative application method." Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed that Mrs. Penelope had discovered something even more disturbing among her brother's effects. A comprehensive dossier on each literary society member, complete with photographs, financial records, and carefully documented evidence of various irregularities. The scope of Mr. Strange's investigation had been far more extensive than anyone had suspected. Her subsequent visit to the village archives, conducted with the patient persistence of someone untangling a particularly complex knitting pattern, yielded a revelation that transformed the entire case. Mr. Strange's research had uncovered a decades-old bequest to the local almshouse, made by a wealthy spinster whose will contained an unusual clause. If the almshouse ever ceased operations, the substantial endowment would revert to her closest living relative. That relative, according to carefully preserved genealogical records, was Mrs. Venetia Blackwood. This discovery cast Mrs. Blackwood's involvement with the Literary Society's charitable activities in an entirely new light. If Mr. Strange had uncovered irregularities in the almshouse's current operation, or even threatened to create such irregularities, he would have possessed leverage far more valuable than the mere £200 missing from the Society's account. The evening brought her nephew Raymond to her cottage in a state of considerable agitation. His usual artistic composure had been replaced by nervous energy that manifested in restless pacing and frequent adjustments to his spectacles. "The most peculiar thing, Aunt Jane," he began, accepting her offer of tea with distracted gratitude. "I've been thinking about Strange's behavior during our previous encounters. He approached me several weeks ago with investment opportunities that seemed distinctly questionable. Schemes promising enormous returns with minimal risk. When I declined, he made rather pointed comments about my publisher's past financial dealings, suggesting he possessed information that could damage my professional relationships. This revelation expanded the scope of Mr. Strange's activities beyond simple financial blackmail into the realm of professional and personal reputation destruction. He had been systematically gathering compromising information about multiple villagers, creating a web of potential victims that extended far beyond the Literary Society's membership. As the evening deepened and rain began pattering against her cottage windows, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, her mind arranging and rearranging the day's discoveries. The scorched notebook suggested someone had attempted to destroy evidence but had been interrupted. The pearl-headed pins and references to alternative application methods indicated careful preparation for multiple contingencies. Most significantly, the almshouse inheritance provided Mrs. Blackwood with a motive worth thousands of pounds rather than mere hundreds. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple's consciousness, a detail that didn't quite fit the emerging pattern. Mr. Strange had been meticulous in his preparations, systematic in his research, and careful in his approach to potential victims. Why then had he allowed himself to be poisoned during an evening he had personally orchestrated? The contradiction suggested that someone else had been planning equally carefully, using his own elaborate preparations as the stage for his elimination. The candles that wouldn't go out had been selected not merely for reliable illumination, but to ensure that every detail of the evening's events would be clearly visible to those who understood how to observe. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was sleeping peacefully, confident that the obvious suspects would continue to occupy official attention while they remained safely hidden among the shocked community. Miss Marple's needles clicked in their steady rhythm as she contemplated the elegant complexity of the crime. The most dangerous secrets, she had learned, often lay disguised as the mundane details that everyone else overlooked. Pearl-headed pins, trimmed candle stubs, and the careful positioning of light sources designed to illuminate everything except the truth itself. Inspector Slack's confidence had crystallized overnight into what he considered elegant certainty, and Tuesday morning found him at Grafton House with the bearing of a man who believed himself moments away from closing his first murder case. His theory possessed the appealing simplicity that he preferred in criminal matters. Mrs. Blackwood, desperate to conceal her embezzlement of the literary society funds, had poisoned Mr. Strange when he threatened exposure. The missing money provided motive, her access to the drawing room offered opportunity, and her composed behavior struck him as suspicious artifice designed to deflect suspicion. Miss Marple, who encountered him departing with renewed determination, reflected that such neat conclusions often overlooked the complexities that made human nature endlessly fascinating. Her subsequent visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery, ostensibly for her monthly examination, provided insights that Inspector Slack's direct approach had entirely missed. The dosage was remarkably precise, Dr. Haydock confided while checking her blood pressure, his professional discretion allowing general observations about digitalist poisoning. Too much would have caused immediate collapse. Too little might have been survivable with prompt treatment. Someone with considerable medical knowledge calculated exactly the amount needed to ensure death within a specific time frame. More significantly, Dr. Haydock revealed that Mr. Strange had visited his surgery 3 weeks prior, complaining of chest pains and requesting a thorough cardiac examination. The results had been completely normal, yet Mr. Strange had seemed almost disappointed by the clean bill of health, asking specifically about digitalist sensitivity and whether certain individuals might be more susceptible than others. Curious thing was his interest in my medical bag, Dr. Haydock continued, frowning at the memory. Asked about its contents, the locking mechanism, how often I carried it on house calls. Said he was researching a character for a novel, but the question struck me as rather too specific for literary purposes. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of Mr. Strange's final weeks. He hadn't been merely gathering blackmail material. He had been actively researching his own potential vulnerabilities while simultaneously investigating methods of administering digitalies to others. Her afternoon encounter with Colonel Melchett at the post office provided another crucial piece of the expanding puzzle. The colonel's defensive bluster about his financial management had intensified, but beneath his military bearing lay genuine fear that manifested in nervous gestures and frequent glances over his shoulder. The almshouse fund, he confessed quietly, drawing her aside with the desperation of someone who could no longer bear the weight of his secret. Strange had discovered everything. The discrepancies, the missing receipts, the funds diverted to cover an unfortunate investment. He demanded immediate payment to keep his silence, said he had another arrangement to complete that very evening and needed cash. This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that Mr. Strange had been operating a systematic blackmail network, with multiple victims providing him with the financial resources his desperate circumstances required. The missing literary society funds were merely one thread in a much larger tapestry of extortion. Her evening visit to Mrs. Blackwood found the woman in a state of barely controlled agitation, her usual composed dignity replaced by an almost feverish intensity. Over tea served with trembling hands, Mrs. Blackwood launched into what appeared to be a carefully rehearsed confession. "I cannot bear the suspicion any longer," she declared, her voice carrying theatrical precision. "Yes, I took the Literary Society money, £200 to cover temporary difficulties with my household accounts. I intended to replace it before anyone noticed, but Mr. Strange discovered the irregularity during his research into our charitable activities." Miss Marple listened with patient attention, though she noted several curious details about the confession. The story was almost too convenient, explaining the missing money while providing a clear motive for murder, yet it failed to address the elaborate preparations that had preceded Mr. Strange's death. Most tellingly, if Mrs. Blackwood had indeed murdered to prevent exposure of her embezzlement, why had she announced the missing money herself during the Literary Society meeting? As her visitor departed into the evening mist, Miss Marple examined the small evidence she had been quietly collecting. The pearl-headed pin that Gladys had given her still carried that distinctive sweet scent, now identified as benzoin used to mask other odors. The pattern of Mr. Strange's activities suggested a man who had been simultaneously hunter and hunted, gathering compromising information while researching methods of self-protection that had ultimately proved inadequate. The candles that wouldn't go out had been selected not merely for reliable illumination, but to ensure that every detail of the evening's events would be clearly visible to those who understood how to observe. Yet someone had managed to administer a precisely calculated dose of digitalis to a man who was actively guarding against such an attack, using his own elaborate preparations as the stage for his elimination. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple realized, a murderer was orchestrating an elaborate deception, using genuine guilt and obvious motives as cover for a far more sophisticated crime. The game was approaching its climax, and she intended to ensure that truth would illuminate the darkness as steadily as those fortified wicks had burned throughout that fatal evening. Inspector Slack's triumphant arrival at Grafton House on Wednesday morning carried all the theatrical weight of a man convinced that murder investigations required nothing more than obvious motives and convenient confessions. Miss Marple, who happened to be tending her late roses at precisely the moment when dramatic events unfolded, observed with quiet interest as Mrs. Blackwood emerged with dignified resignation, her pale blue eyes meeting the assembled villagers with an expression that seemed almost relieved. The arrest sent ripples of excitement through St. Mary Mead's carefully maintained social fabric. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a lesson about trusting people with charitable funds, while Miss Hartnell suggested that excessive candlelight had clearly addled Mrs. Blackwood's moral judgment. Dr. Haydock, however, watched the proceedings with the troubled expression of someone whose professional instincts remained unsatisfied by such neat conclusions. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the post office, ostensibly to collect her weekly correspondence, provided her with the opportunity to observe the village's collective response to recent developments. The general consensus favored Inspector Slack's efficiency, though several thoughtful individuals expressed private doubts about the case's apparent simplicity. Her afternoon call upon Gladys, who had been left to maintain Grafton House during her employer's absence, proved illuminating in ways that Inspector Slack's direct methods had entirely missed. The parlor maid, grateful for any kindness during her distressing circumstances, revealed details that cast Mrs. Blackwood's confession in an entirely different light. She seemed almost eager to tell them about the missing money, Gladys confided while polishing silver with nervous energy. But when they asked about other things, the little blue bottle, those pearl-headed pins, the way she arranged everything so particular that evening, she went all quiet and strange-like. Miss Marple examined the drawing room with renewed attention, noting how thoroughly it had been cleaned since the fatal evening. Yet her experienced eye caught details that others had overlooked. The ornate silver box on the mantelpiece had been repositioned, and the shallow dish behind the decanters still bore faint traces of the benzoin-scented water that had once held floating candles secured with pearl-headed pins. More significantly, her gentle questioning revealed that Mrs. Blackwood had spent considerable time that afternoon rearranging the candle display, ensuring each taper was positioned at precisely the correct height and angle. The pearl-headed pins, ostensibly for securing floating arrangements, had been carefully cleaned and returned to their designated container, all except one, which Gladys had discovered embedded in the carpet beneath Mr. Strange's chair. Dr. Haydock's afternoon visit to Miss Marple's cottage, conducted under the pretext of checking on her health following recent village excitement, provided the final confirmation she required. His professional unease about the digitalis administration had been troubling him, particularly after examining his medical bag more carefully. "The curious thing," he confided while accepting her offer of tea, is that someone had been through my bag that evening. The clasp showed scratches, and my emergency digitalis solution, a concentrated preparation for cardiac episodes, had been disturbed. The bottle was returned to its proper position, but not quite as I had left it. Miss Marple's gentle observation that medical bags must be terribly complex to organize properly elicited a detailed explanation of their contents and arrangement. Dr. Haydick's description confirmed her growing suspicions about both opportunity and method, though she maintained the expression of someone following a conversation slightly beyond her immediate comprehension. As evening approached, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, her mind arranging the day's discoveries into their final pattern. Mrs. Blackwood's confession had been carefully orchestrated to provide Inspector Slack with exactly the solution he expected, while concealing the far more sophisticated crime that had actually occurred. The missing literary society funds were genuine, but they represented a convenient distraction rather than a motive for murder. Someone had recognized that Mrs. Blackwood's guilt about the embezzlement would make her the perfect scapegoat, particularly if she could be encouraged to confess voluntarily rather than face the shame of exposure. The candles that wouldn't go out had been selected not merely for reliable illumination, but to ensure that every detail of the evening's carefully choreographed performance would be clearly visible. The pearl-headed pins, the benzoin-scented water, the precisely positioned silver box, all had been elements in an elaborate deception designed to eliminate Mr. Strange while directing suspicion toward obvious targets. Miss Marple's needles clicked in their steady rhythm as she contemplated the elegant complexity of the crime. Someone with medical knowledge and access to concentrated digitalis had used Mr. Strange's own systematic caution against him, administering the poison through a method he would never have suspected. The murderer had been hiding in plain sight throughout the investigation, their obvious innocence providing perfect camouflage for their guilt. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and Miss Marple intended to ensure that truth would illuminate the darkness as steadily as those fortified wicks had burned throughout that carefully orchestrated evening of murder. The game was nearly over, and justice would soon burn as brightly as the candles that had refused to go out. Miss Marple's cottage had never hosted such a carefully orchestrated tea party, though to the casual observer, Thursday evening's gathering appeared entirely innocent. She had invited a select company under the gentle pretext of organizing a memorial subscription for Mr. Strange's sister, yet her preparations suggested purposes far more serious than charitable collection. The drawing-room bore subtle resemblances to Grafton House's fatal arrangement. Candles positioned with mathematical precision, their fortified wicks burning with unwavering steadiness, despite the October drafts that stirred the curtains. Dr. Haydick arrived first, his medical bag accompanying him as always, though Miss Marple noticed how his eyes immediately catalogued the room's arrangements with nervous intensity. Colonel Melchett followed with his wife Dolly, both wearing the strained expressions of people who had endured too much village drama in recent days. Inspector Slack entered with the confident bearing of a man who believed his case concluded, while Mrs. Blackwood, released temporarily for the memorial discussion, moved with the resigned dignity of someone who had accepted her fate. "Do sit wherever you feel comfortable," Miss Marple said gently, though her seemingly casual directions placed each person with deliberate precision. "Dr. Haydock, perhaps by the mantelpiece where the light is better for your reading glasses. Colonel Melchett, that chair by the window suits your military bearing perfectly." As tea was served and conversation began with the expected condolences, Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm while her keen eyes observed every gesture, every meaningful glance, every telltale sign of nervous tension. The floating candles in their shallow bowl cast dancing reflections across the pearl-headed pins that secured them, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mesmerize her guests. "I'm afraid," Miss Marple began conversationally, "that we have been rather too hasty in accepting obvious explanations for Mr. Strange's death. Human nature, you see, is rarely as straightforward as we might wish. Mrs. Blackwood's confession, while touching in its desire to protect others, fails to account for the true complexity of what occurred that evening. She set down her teacup with gentle precision. Mr. Strange was not simply an unfortunate victim of village financial irregularities. He was a systematic blackmailer, driven by desperate circumstances to exploit the secrets he had so carefully uncovered. His research extended far beyond the Literary Society's missing funds. He had discovered Colonel Melchett's difficulties with the almshouse accounts, my nephew's publishers' past indiscretions, and most significantly, the substantial inheritance that would revert to Mrs. Blackwood should the almshouse cease operations. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and Dr. Haydock's sharp intake of breath. But Mr. Strange was also a cautious man. Miss Marple continued, her needles never pausing in their work. He visited Dr. Haydock weeks before his death, ostensibly for cardiac examination, but actually researching his own vulnerabilities. He inquired about digitalis sensitivity, about the contents of medical bags, about who might be most susceptible to such poisoning. He was preparing to defend himself against the very method that would ultimately destroy him. Dr. Haydock's cup rattled against its saucer as his hands began to tremble. Miss Marple, surely you don't suggest— I suggest nothing, Doctor. I merely observe. Her voice remained gentle, but her eyes had acquired the steely quality that those who knew her well recognized as dangerous. Mr. Strange was so wary of poisoned drinks that he deliberately switched his sherry glass that evening, believing he was avoiding a prepared trap. But his own notes, found in his scorched ledger, contained a telling phrase. If subject resists prepared glass, employ alternative application method. She reached for one of the pearl-headed pins from the floating arrangement, holding it delicately between her fingers. These innocent little pins, used for Mrs. Blackwood's charming candle displays, provided the perfect alternative method. The drawing room was so carefully illuminated by candles that would not go out, fortified wicks designed to burn steadily regardless of atmospheric disturbances, ensuring that every detail would remain visible throughout the evening's carefully choreographed events. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on Dr. Haydock with unwavering intensity. When Mr. Strange switched his glass, you knew your initial plan had failed. But you had prepared for such contingencies. You were the only person present with the medical knowledge to calculate a precise digitalis dosage, the only one with access to concentrated emergency solutions, and the only one whose professional bag had been tampered with that evening. Dr. Haydock's face had gone ashen, but he maintained his silence with desperate determination. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Miss Marple continued, you coated a pearl-headed pin with a calculated dose of digitalis from your emergency supply, just enough to cause cardiac arrest in a man of Mr. Strange's age and constitution. During the commotion caused by Mrs. Blackwood's announcement about the missing funds, you approached him under the guise of professional concern. A gentle touch, perhaps a pat on the shoulder or a moment of feigned sympathy, was sufficient to introduce the poisoned pin to his system. She gestured toward the benzoin-scented candles. The sweet fragrance that Mrs. Blackwood had been persuaded to use served perfectly to mask any medicinal odors that might have betrayed your preparations. The pin, having served its deadly purpose, was discarded near his chair, where Gladys later discovered it embedded in the carpet. The room held its breath as Dr. Haydock's composure finally cracked. His professional mask slipped away, revealing the desperate fear beneath. He was destroying everything, he whispered hoarsely. My practice, my reputation, my family's future. He knew about the investments, the patient confidentiality I'd broken for financial gain. He would have ruined me completely. Inspector Slack stepped forward with grim efficiency, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. The precise dosage ensured a delayed reaction, mimicking natural cardiac arrest while giving you time to establish your innocence. You counted on Mrs. Blackwood's genuine guilt about the embezzled funds to provide the perfect scapegoat. someone who would confess to a lesser crime rather than face exposure of far more damaging secrets. As Dr. Haydock was led away, his shoulders bowed with the weight of his confession, Miss Marple extinguished the floating candles one by one. The pearl-headed pins, their deadly secret finally revealed, glinted in the dying light like tiny accusations. "The candles that wouldn't go out," she murmured to herself, "were designed to illuminate everything except the truth itself. But truth, like candlelight, has a way of burning steadily until it reveals even the darkest corners of human nature." Justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead could finally rest peacefully, though the memory of those unwavering flames would linger long after the last candle had been extinguished.